Hey guys, so today I am going to make a video about stitching in hand. I stitch in hand exclusively. I don't use a hoop or a frame or a stand for any of my projects. That includes like the Mirabilias I stitch in hand. I just started a big chatelaine, I'm stitching that in hand. So I thought I would just talk about it and try to show you how I do it if you wanted to give it a try, and I encourage you to. Okay, so first I feel like I have to talk about my history as a stitcher a little bit. I learned how to cross stitch probably when I was like 10, 11, 12, and I had done some, it's really funny, both my grandmas cross-stitched and my mom cross-stitched, but sorry, I'm really sneezy today, so I apologize if this video is really like choppy. It's because I'm sneezing or coughing. So both my grandmas cross-stitched and my mom cross-stitched, but none of them taught me how to do it. As far as I can remember, I kind of came upon it on my own. But before that, I had done rug hook, which you can still buy, which I think is awesome. Rug hooking. And I don't know, okay, I don't know what this is called, but I remember doing it a lot as a kid. And in hindsight, it's like the lamest, it's like the lamest thing. It says a lot about childhood McKenzie, I think. No, okay, so I'm gonna explain it, and if you know what it is, please tell me what it is, because I have a very vivid memory of it. So the tool, you got like, it was like a plastic tube, and it was like this long maybe, and it had 4 hooks on the top, and then you would use yarn, presumably. I used yarn, and it was some combination of like looping and pulling on the top, and then it would like spit out this like tube of yarn out the bottom. I don't know what it's called. But I just remember doing it a lot, and it was, which is hilarious because it didn't make anything. It just made these like tubes of, just made these weird tubes. I think the only thing that actually came of it for me was I had made like, I just made like feet, like 6 feet of tube, and just for nothing. I don't know, ridiculous. I enjoy repetitive tasks. So anyways, my mom, what she did with it was we made a rug for my Barbie house out of it. Like, she just took a big section of it and like rolled it flat into a circle and then stitched it together. So that's what that became. I do not know the name of that craft or what it's supposed to produce, but that's what I did. And looking back, it's kind of amazing that I didn't get into crochet or something because of all the looping and hooking. Anyway, so I did some of that, and then my mom is always really great at like finding crafts and stuff for us to do together. And so I remember making like shrinky dinks, being obsessed with those. And that thing that I'm sure every kid does in like Sunday school or whatever, where you put bits of crayon in between 2 pieces of wax paper and then you iron it and it looks like stained glass. Stuff like that. So I had done some crafty stuff, but I hadn't really ever like, I don't remember how I learned to do that tube thing. I don't know. Like, was that a weird fever dream I had? I don't know. I don't know what that was, but like I said, I vividly remember doing it. And up until just like several years ago, we still had that rug for my Barbies that I had made out of all that yarn. Anyways, so but I hadn't really learned how to do any kind of stitch or stitching. And so I remember, sorry, having an eyelash problem. My mom, whenever she had the family over, like if it was our turn to have Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, she would always make a centerpiece for her table. And I don't mean make like hot glue something, although I'm sure she did that too, but it would be more so like we would go to a craft store and she would buy like a bowl or something and like fill it with something, you know, stuff like that. She's a creative lady. She doesn't think she is, but she is. So I remember going to Lewis Craft, which was our craft store in Thunder Bay, and I don't know if they still exist at all, but it was like a Michael's type craft store, probably because my mom was looking to make a centerpiece or buy something for her table or whatever. And so I found this book, and it must have been something like 30 easy cross-stitch projects where they weren't flat pieces of cross-stitch, like they weren't patterned like that. It was, you were making things. So I asked my mom if I could get that, and she said, sure. I'm sure she said, sure, your grandma does that, and I did that. Like, if you wanted to learn that, I could have taught you. But, so, bought this book, and plastic canvas, and yarn, and the big blue plastic needle. And then I just made some stuff. And I remember making like a bookmark, and I remember making a tissue box cover, because it seems like every publication of that type had like a tissue box cover in it. And then my big ticket project, which I'm sure were my Christmas presents that year, were mugs. And I think I'm sure you can still get these, like clear plastic mugs where the lip of the mug is like removable, and then there's a space in between the layers of plastic for you to like put like a picture or something like that. So the book I had, it told you like the size you would need for the mug, and then you would just like roll it and like put it in the mug and put the lip on, and then it would be like a mug with a cross-stitch design in it. And I must have done that on like Ada. I don't think you could do plastic canvas for that. But I remember I made my dad a sport-themed one, because I'm sure it was the only masculine, vaguely masculine design in the whole book. It had like a basketball and a football and a soccer ball, and totally not appropriate for him, but like I said, I'm sure it was the only like dad one in there. And then for my mom, I made pansies, like 3 or 4 pansy flowers. And so I gave them these mugs, and we had them up until like a few years ago. I remember seeing them, at least, maybe not in this house, but definitely in our last house we still had them. And I just asked my mom about them the other day, because that's the only thing I can remember making really clearly. Like, as far as stitching that I did before I started again recently. Like, I remember those. I remember like putting a lot of time into them and being really proud of them and like giving them as presents. And I'm sure, yeah, and we don't have them anymore, and my mom felt really bad. But I think what happened was at least one of them got like water damaged in between the layers, so I'm sure we just chucked them. So anyways, the point of all that was to say that up until just a couple years ago, my experience with cross-stitch when I was like a tween was I didn't make anything big enough to need a hoop, or like I had never stitched a kit. Even those beginner kits that you can get, that wasn't like the path I took into cross-stitch. I took this weird crafty, like where you make things out of plastic canvas. So I had no experience with like hoops or anything at that point. And then when I started cross-stitching again, which was, actually I can tell you exactly when it was, because it was when I was on my medical leave, and I kept my little doctor thing for, I don't know, posterity. I'm a weirdo. So I started stitching again December 2012. That was when this happened. And when this happened, I was encouraged to do things that made me happy, and I didn't really know what that was, really. And so I just kind of found my way back into stitching. And in 2012, so I've only really been stitching for real for like 3 years. And in 2012, I mean, I was on Etsy, I was on Subversive Cross Stitch. Like, there were way more outlets, just like now, for finding these awesome patterns. So when I started, I made a bunch of little things just out of Ada. And again, I think anyone would hold those in their hand. Maybe not, but it seems logical. It wasn't until I did my big classic book spines piece, which I talk about in a video from a long time ago, a couple years ago, about my finished projects. I'll link that somewhere on the screen if you want to see that. It was a big pattern from Etsy of different book spines, like on a bookshelf style, facing out. That was the first big thing I did. And I remember when I decided that I wanted to start that pattern, not knowing how to do it. Like, I had the thread and I had the Aida, but I remember going to my mom and being like, it's big, like what do I do with it? You know? And I think she said, well, you could use a hoop. And so we looked upstairs and this was the only hoop we had. It's so old and it's like rubberized on the outside, and it's really, really stiff. It's also pretty small for the size of that project. But that was the only thing we had in the house. So I tried this, and I just hated it. It was too tight, which I think is interesting because that might be part of the reason I stitch in hand, is because you set your own tension when you stitch in hand. And you have to find that like sweet spot of like not pulling the fabric or anything. And I know a lot of stitchers like their fabric to be really tight, like really taut. And that's not something I've ever liked. Maybe because this was a bad experience. But so I decided this wasn't gonna work. I also hated the circle, the hoop marks. And I didn't like moving it and like thinking about putting it over top of stitching I'd already done. Something about it just like gave me the jeebies. So, I didn't want to do that, but then I didn't know what to do. So my mom said, I think I still have your grandma's frame upstairs because she doesn't stitch anymore. You want to try that? And I was like, okay. So she hauls out of the closet this humongous wooden like contraption, and it was like a wooden frame. We probably still have it, but I don't know where it is, or I would have shown it to you. Very old, very like creaky, and in hindsight, like not very tight, like all of the tension had kind of gone out of it. And so when we tried to put my fabric on it, like it wasn't a great frame anymore. And it was like a lap frame, I guess. I don't know anything about this stuff. All you people that like use frames and stands all the time, I don't know anything about any of it. So we like, you know, put it into this frame. My mom did. I didn't know how to do it. And like tried to tighten it. And then she just like handed it to me and was like, there you go. And it was like this big, and I didn't know what to do with it. I was like, do I put it on my lap? How do I stitch around it? Like, so my experience with hoops and frames was that I was scared of them. And I think like in hindsight, if I had gone on the internet and looked at how people cross stitch, like if I were starting again now, I probably would have gone to Michael's and bought some Q-snaps. I'm sure that's what I would have done. In fact, I think if I ever wanted to do something not in hand, that's what I would buy. I would buy Q-snaps. So I just might be a totally different stitcher now, had I not had that weird experience with my grandma's old frame and this horrible like rubber hoop. So I just decided at the end of the day with the book spines to just like, I was like, I'm just gonna hold it. I can't stitch around this thing. Like it's this big contraption and I didn't know where to put it. And like I said, I had it in my lap. I'm sure it was meant to go like on a stand, but we didn't have that. So I was like, well, I'm just gonna hold it. And the rest is history. See you next time. Just kidding. So yeah, that kind of became the only way I do things. And like I said, if I were to do anything, I don't think I would use a hoop. I think I would buy some Q-snaps, and I still might. I do kind of want to try them, but I haven't. I have no plans. So, I guess I'll just talk about kind of how I arrange everything. I don't know, this seems really basic to me. This seems really like obvious, but I guess I have to remember that it might not be in the way that like using a frame is completely not obvious to me. So I brought down my Mirabilia because it's fairly big, and I think it would just be a good example of how I do it with like something that has a relatively large amount of fabric. So I stitch one-handed. I think two-handed stitching is amazing and kind of crazy. but I stitch one-handed. My dominant hand is my right hand. So I hold my project in my left hand and I stitch with my right hand. So for my Mirabilia, what I would do, or with anything, and this is like an 18 by 24 piece, I would put it upside down on a table and just start rolling up the left side of it like a poster, like how you would roll anything, up until the point where I want it to work. So I have this like roll, this is the back of the work, on the left side, it's the front of the work. And so all I would do, it's not that much fabric actually, you guys, even if it's like a bigger project, like even holding my chatelaine in hand, it's not that much fabric. So my setup is, I'm just holding everything in my left hand and then I stitch with my right. And I'll also try, I'm going to try and show, I'm going to do a little bit of stitching, not on this because I think it would be too hard to see, and also I didn't bring anything down for it. I'm just going to do a little stitching on like a piece of Aida, but I'm going to show you, I use my back, the hand on the back of the work, my left hand. I stitched through it, not through it. I stitched through my fingers on my left hand, and I don't know how anybody else stitches. This is going to be really interesting for me. Please tell me how you stitch down below, because it's one of those things where you don't realize that people do it differently until you like see people doing it differently. So I have my left hand on the back of my fabric, and what that's doing is it's keeping a little bit of that fabric flat for me to stitch on. Normally I stitch on like a desk or something. I'll put the whole thing down on the desk, or my lap. Stitching on my lap is harder, but I can do it. So I do need like a surface of some kind. And then as I'm stitching, I'll stitch through my fingers. I don't know which ones, these two maybe? That'll become clear when I actually do the stitching. And I use that to feel if I'm getting any knots or not. Like, you know, sometimes if you have a knot and you don't realize, and then you flip over your work and there's like a knot and a huge loop, and it's so frustrating. So I stitch through my fingers for that reason, so that I have something that's telling me what's going on the back. This all might be kind of confusing right now. What else did I want to say? Oh, you can fit like a humongous amount of fabric in your hand. I mean, I have tiny little girl hands, and like truthfully, I mean, I've never done a Heaven and Earth design, but I did stitch Dorian. I didn't stitch all of Dorian. I stitched like a third of Dorian. And that was a humongous piece of Aida, and I held all that in my left hand. I think it's, the more fabric you have, the tighter you just end up rolling it, which I think is better, because the tighter it's rolled, the less crease lines you have. And if you'll see, like, on this piece of fabric, it's not bad at all, because this is a really nice, what fabric is this? Maybe a Lugana? I can't remember. But I like fabrics that are kind of flexible, because if you're stitching in hand and you have a really stiff fabric, you're gonna get a bunch of lines on that left side, or right side if you're left-handed, I guess you would do it that way, of where your hand was, like where it was all rolled up in your hand. So this one, I don't really have that so much. On the left side here, you can see there's like a little bit of line. And then if anything, this side will just curl up a little bit. Like you can see that on my mini mandalas. The one side is just, because they're so tiny, the piece of fabric is so tiny that the one corner will just like curl up on its own. That's the downside of stitching in hand, I think, but I don't know. I don't know if it's worse or better than getting lines or indentations from your frame or from your hoop, but I don't know. That's how I do it, so that's what I'm used to dealing with. So, I'm sorry, that's so gross and rude, but I'm really stuffy today. So I have just like a piece of Aida here, and I'm just gonna get a thread started and start stitching, and I'll just see, I'll have to see how the camera will be set up, but I'll just see if I can show you what my hand is doing on the back of the fabric while I'm stitching. All right, so I've just put in a few little stitches on this piece of Aida, and I'm gonna just hold the fabric up. You can already see what's happening. Hold the fabric up to the camera and keep stitching, and hopefully then you'll be able to see what my hand is doing on the back of my project. So if this were a bigger piece, all of the fabric on this side of what I'm working on would be in this hand. That's how I would hold it. And so all I'm doing as I'm stitching is I'm literally stitching in between two of my fingers on the back of the project. I don't really know why I started doing this. That's why. So you can tell when you have a knot. No, I don't really know. This is just kind of what felt the most natural to me. So that's what I kept doing. But I like having a sense of what's going on the back of my project. And I think if you stitch two-handed, you probably get something like this because you do have a hand on the back there working all the time. But this is how I stitch everything. And I'm just thinking, oh, you can still see me. I can keep going. I'm just thinking, I've gotten some questions about if I railroad my stitches or if I use a trolley needle, and I don't. I don't know if this has something to do with it. Probably not. This is a thought I'm just having now for the first time, but because the thread is going through my fingers, going through a really tight space, it might be smoothing it out more than it would be if your hand wasn't on the back of the fabric. So that's something to think about, I guess. So this is how I stitch. Do you guys think it's weird? It might be kind of weird. But yeah, so like I said, all of my fabric would be rolled up in this hand, the hand that's on the back, the hand that's not stitching, obviously. And then I just use the rest of that hand to kind of splay across the back of the work. And then I stitch in between these top two fingers. And like I said, that's just so that I know what's going on back there. This might be really interesting. I want to know how you do this. Do you keep a hand on the back of your fabric? Like two-handed stitching, I know you've got one back there anyways. So that would probably catch a lot of like the knots or tangles that might happen. But like if you stitch one-handed and you use a hoop or a frame, what do you do with your other hand? Is that a silly question? I don't know. Like I said, it's just one of those things where this is the way I do it. And it's kind of the only way I know because it's the way that feels the best to me. So I don't really have any desire to change it. Although, like I said, if I tried anything not in hand, I would try a Q-snap. But then I would lose this, the ability to do this, because I would have to hold the Q-snap with my left hand. And I really like having a hand on the back of my work to kind of know what's going on. So yeah, I don't know how I started doing this, but this is how I do it. I just stitch in between my fingers. This is how I stitch everything. Like, obviously metallics and silk and stuff, but beading, I bead this way too. Every time I'm doing anything on my fabric, I'm doing it between my two fingers on the back, like that. So yeah, that is how I stitch. I stitch in hand. Like I said, it's kind of the only way I've ever done it. I didn't talk too much about tension in this video because I don't know a lot about tension and I don't want to talk about what I don't know about, but I understand that if you don't have something that's pulling your fabric taut, like Aida, we know how stiff Aida is. But if you're working on like that Mirabilia, say you're working on my Mirabilia, on that Lugana, and you're doing it like how I would, you're holding everything in your left hand, you're stitching through your fingers with your right hand, that fabric is pretty floppy and pretty loose. Loose isn't the right word. Flexible isn't the right word. Hopefully you know what I mean. It's not stiff. It's soft. Let's call it soft. So there is a certain amount of self-adjusting you have to do so that your tension is good. Useless sentences with McKenzie. No, what I'm saying is, if you have a tendency to stitch really tightly, if you're stitching in hand, you're gonna pucker your fabric because you don't have that hoop or frame that's holding everything steady for you. I think, have the tendency to stitch pretty loosely, which is why it's never really been a problem for me. I stitch pretty loosely. I don't even really pull. Like, you know, some people pull their stitch. I don't pull at all. So I think for me, this just ended up being a good fit. Maybe I'm a stitcher. I was gonna say I'm a loose stitcher. I'm not a loose stitcher. Don't spread that rumor. So maybe I just stitch, my stitches are a little more loose, and so stitching in hand just happens to be a good fit for me. This was like a serendipitous arrangement that this is what I ended up doing. Anyways, I hope you found this interesting. I want to know how you stitch. I really do. And I hope if you've never stitched in hand that you just give it a try. Just once. It's like, you don't need any extra tools to do it, so you don't have to go out and buy something just to try it. You can just try it. Just pick a smaller project if that's intimidating for you, all the fabric, and just roll it up and put it in your left hand and just see, or your right hand, obviously, whatever hand works, and just see how it feels. Just see if you can do it. Something I didn't mention, this is kind of common knowledge, but if you find that you have a lot of extra fabric, like I did when I was working on Dorian, although that was Ada, so it tended to kind of stay in place a little more, like it wasn't flopping everywhere, I just use clothespins. Like if I'm working in like the lower part of a design and I have all this fabric up here, that's not going to go in my hand, obviously, because it's on the top. So I'm holding the left side and I still have all this stuff on the top that's just in my way. I'll just fold it over itself a couple times and just clip it with a clothespin so that I end up having a more controlled space to work in. But like I said, I don't really have to do that often. This might just be what I'm used to. I'm used to allowing for the fabric there. But yeah, so like I said, please give it a try. Stitch in hand. Just like one time, so that if you're ever stuck on an island without your Millennium stand, you could still stitch, right? That could happen. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.